My husband said I should lose the baby weight before he takes me out in public again. So I went out with his best friend. Our daughter was 4 months old. I'd gained 35 pounds during pregnancy and lost 20 already. But apparently that wasn't enough for Keith. It's embarrassing, he said, looking at me getting dressed for his company dinner. What will people think? Maybe next year when you're back to normal? I stood there holding the dress I'd bought specifically for this event while he straightened his tie. I gave birth 16 weeks ago, I said. Exactly. And Rebecca had her baby 6 months ago, and look at her now. Back in her size 2 jeans. Effort. Rebecca, whose husband hired a personal trainer and nutritionist. Rebecca, who had a tummy tuck that she told everyone was just good genes. So I'm not going? I asked. It's for the best. I'll tell everyone you're sick. He kissed my forehead like he was doing me a favor. Order whatever you want for dinner. Just try to make healthy choices. After he left, I sat on our bed crying until the baby woke up. I was feeding her when my phone rang. It was Jake, Keith's best friend since college. Hey, Keith just called to say you're sick? You okay? I'm fine, I said. Just not presentable enough for public, apparently. Silence. Then, what? I told him what Keith had said. Word for word. Jake was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. That's fucked up, he finally said. Sorry for the language, but that's completely fucked up. It's fine. I'll lose the weight eventually. No, it's not fine. You just had a baby. You look amazing. Keith's being an asshole. I started crying again. Couldn't help it. Listen, Jake said. I was going to skip the company thing anyway. Want to get dinner? You and the baby? There's that new Italian place downtown. Keith would be furious. Keith's too busy impressing his coworkers to notice. He was right. Keith wouldn't check on me. He never did during these events. Okay, I said. Pick me up in an hour. I put on the dress I'd bought. It fit perfectly. Not like before the baby, but it wasn't supposed to. I curled my hair, did my makeup, looked like myself for the first time in months. Jake showed up with flowers. You look incredible, he said. And he meant it. I could tell. The restaurant was beautiful. White tablecloths, candles, the kind of place Keith always promised to take me but never did. Jake had made a reservation and they had a high chair ready for the baby. Keith's an idiot, Jake said after we ordered. I'm sorry, I know he's my friend, but he's being an idiot. He's always been like this, I said. Even before the baby. Nothing I do is enough. Why do you stay? Where would I go? I haven't worked in 2 years. He controls all the money. Jake was quiet, watching me feed the baby small bites of mashed potatoes. You know what kills me? He said. Keith doesn't deserve you. Never has. He was like this in college too. Had this amazing girlfriend junior year, treated her like trash because she wasn't some magazine model. What happened to her? She left him. Married a doctor. Has 3 kids and looks happy as hell on Facebook. Keith still stalks her page. We talked for 2 hours. About books, movies, life before I became invisible in my own marriage. Jake told me about his divorce, how his ex-wife had affairs, but somehow made him feel like it was his fault. Manipulation's funny like that, he said. Makes you think you're the problem. The baby started fussing, so we got the check. In the parking lot, Jake was helping me get her into the car seat when a familiar voice said, "What the hell is this?" Keith was standing there with 3 coworkers, including Rebecca in her size 2 jeans. His face was purple. The dinner ended early, he said. Thought I'd check on my sick wife. I felt better, I said. So you went out with Jake? You said I wasn't presentable enough for public, I said. Jake disagreed. Keith's coworkers were staring. Rebecca's mouth was open. We're going home right now, Keith said, grabbing my arm. Jake stepped between us. No, you're not. Not like this. This is between me and my wife. Your wife who you told wasn't good enough to be seen with? Jake said loudly. Who you left at home because she hasn't lost baby weight 4 months after giving birth. The coworkers exchanged looks. Rebecca actually stepped back. That's not what happened, Keith said. Really? Because she called me crying after you told her she was too embarrassing to bring to your company dinner. This is none of your business, Jake. You made it my business when you treated her like trash. Keith turned to me. Get in the car. Now. No, I said. What? I said no. I'm not going home with you. I stood there in the parking lot watching Keith's face change colors like some kind of broken traffic light. His boss, Cody Riggs, had his arms crossed and looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Rebecca kept staring at her shoes. The other 2 coworkers whispered to each other. Jake's hand stayed on my arm, and I could feel him standing solid next to me while Keith tried to put on his fake smile. He laughed, but it came out wrong. Nobody laughed with him. Cody shook his head and walked toward his car. Rebecca followed without looking back. Keith's face went from purple to white to red again. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Jake opened my car door and helped me get the baby buckled in, while Keith just stood there. I got in the passenger seat and Jake drove away. I watched Keith get smaller in the side mirror until we turned the corner and he disappeared. Jake drove me to his apartment while my hands shook so bad I couldn't hold my phone. The baby made little sleeping sounds in her car seat. Jake kept talking in this calm voice about how I could stay with him as long as I needed. He said his guest room had clean sheets already. He said we'd figure out next steps tomorrow. He talked like I was a real person who deserved help instead of someone who'd just blown up her whole life in a restaurant parking lot. My brain couldn't catch up to what just happened. I'd said no to Keith, in front of his boss, in front of his co-workers. I'd actually said no. Jake parked and helped me carry the baby upstairs. His apartment was neat and quiet. He showed me the guest room, and it had a real bed with pillows and everything. He brought me tea while I fed the baby. I started crying again and couldn't stop. Jake sat in the doorway and didn't try to make me feel better with stupid words. He just stayed there until the baby fell asleep and I stopped shaking. Keith called 17 times that night. I watched my phone light up over and over. Each time it buzzed, I jumped. Jake finally took my phone around midnight and typed out a text. He showed it to me before sending. It said I was safe and would contact Keith through a lawyer. Keith called 3 more times after that, but Jake turned my phone off. The baby slept in a portable crib Jake borrowed from his neighbor. I lay awake in the dark staring at the ceiling. I was a single mother now. No income, no plan, no access to money because Keith controlled everything. Tomorrow I needed to buy diapers and I had maybe $40 in my purse. That was it. $40 between me and my daughter and the rest of our lives. I thought about going back, walking to Keith's car in the morning and apologizing and begging him to forgive me. Then I remembered his face when he grabbed my arm, the way he talked to me like I was a dog that needed training. I couldn't go back to that. I wouldn't. Morning came too fast. The baby woke up hungry and I fed her with the last bottle I'd packed. I needed to buy formula, diapers, wipes, all the stuff that cost money I didn't have. I found my purse and pulled out my debit card. Jake drove me to the pharmacy because I didn't have my car. Keith had the keys. I loaded up a basket with baby supplies and went to pay. The card reader beeped. Declined. I tried again. Declined. The pharmacist looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. Heat rushed to my face. Other people waited in line behind me. I wanted to disappear. The pharmacist leaned forward and said quietly that she left her husband last year. She knew exactly what this felt like. She said it gets better. Jake appeared next to me and handed his card to the pharmacist. He paid for everything, and when I tried to say I'd pay him back, he told me to stop. He said we'd figure it out. He said I wasn't alone. I cried in his car in the pharmacy parking lot while the baby played with her feet in the back seat. I called my parents from Jake's apartment. My mom answered on the first ring like she'd been sitting by the phone waiting. I told her everything. Every word Keith said. Every awful comment about my body. How he wouldn't take me to his company dinner. How I went with Jake instead. How Keith found us. How I left. My mom was quiet for a long time. Then she said they were coming. She said they'd be there in 3 hours. My dad got on the phone and asked if I was safe. I said yes. He asked if the baby was safe. I said yes. He said good. He said they loved me. He said we'd figure this out together. They showed up exactly 3 hours later with my dad's face looking like someone had punched him. He hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe. My mom held the baby and cried. We sat at Jake's kitchen table and I told them everything again. All the things I'd hidden for years. How Keith controlled the money. How he criticized everything I did. How nothing was ever good enough. My dad's jaw got tight. My mom reached across the table and held my hand. That afternoon, we went to a bank and opened an account in just my name. My parents transferred $2,000 into it. My mom said it was a start. My dad said they'd help as much as I needed. My mom stayed with me the next day while my dad went to the house with Jake. They needed to get clothes and baby supplies. All the stuff we'd need to actually live. I sat on Jake's couch feeding the baby and waiting. My phone buzzed with updates. My dad texted that Keith tried to refuse them entry. My dad texted that he threatened to call the police. My dad texted that Keith backed down. They came back 2 hours later with 6 bags of essentials. Baby clothes. My clothes. Bottles. The good blanket. My dad pulled me aside and said Keith had been ranting the whole time, yelling about how I was trying to ruin his career, how I humiliated him in front of his boss, how everyone at his office was talking about what happened. My dad said Keith never once asked about me or the baby. He only cared about his reputation. The company dinner incident was apparently all over his workplace. People were talking. Keith's perfect image was cracking. Keith's mother, Heidi, called that evening. I almost didn't answer. She started with how she was sure this was all a misunderstanding. How Keith was under a lot of stress at work. How maybe I misunderstood what he meant. I was done protecting him. I repeated exactly what he said about me being too embarrassing for public. Word for word. There was a long silence on the phone. Heidi said she needed to call me back. I knew what that meant. She was going to talk to Keith first. She was going to believe whatever story he told her. She was going to take his side because that's what mothers like her do. I hung up and my mom was standing in the doorway. She'd heard everything. She muttered that some women will excuse anything their sons do. She said Heidi was probably calling Keith right now to warn him. She said we needed to move fast before Keith did something worse. My mom found a lawyer through her book club, Victoria Harding. She worked with women leaving bad marriages. Her specialty was emotional abuse cases. We met her the next morning at her office downtown. Victoria had gray hair and kind eyes, and she listened to everything without looking shocked. I told her about Keith controlling all the money, about him locking me out of accounts, about what he said about my body, about the parking lot confrontation. Victoria took notes and nodded. She said Keith's financial control was textbook abuse. She said we could get emergency temporary support orders within days. She explained how the process worked, what forms we'd file, what the judge would consider. She made it sound possible, like I wasn't crazy for leaving, like I had rights even though I hadn't worked in 2 years. She said we'd start the paperwork that afternoon. Victoria filed for temporary custody and child support and spousal support. That same day, she said Keith would get served with papers at his office the next morning. She said he would probably react badly. She said to record everything. The next morning, my phone rang at 9. Keith was screaming. Actually screaming about how I was humiliating him at work, how I was destroying his reputation, how everyone saw him get served with divorce papers, how his boss called him into a meeting, how I was ruining his life. Victoria had predicted this almost word for word. She told me to let it go to voicemail. I did. Keith left a 3-minute message full of threats and accusations. Victoria listened to it once and added it to our evidence file. She said judges don't like men who threaten their wives. She said this recording would help us. Jake helped me that afternoon with something I didn't expect. He'd been through a divorce where his ex-wife did similar financial stuff. He knew what information we needed. We sat at his kitchen table with my laptop and created spreadsheets. Every account Keith locked me out of. Every shared expense I could remember. His income from his job. Our spending patterns over the last 2 years. My complete financial dependence on him. Jake knew exactly what questions Victoria would ask. He helped me document everything in a way that made sense. Page after page of proof that I couldn't survive without support. That Keith had controlled every dollar. That I'd been trapped. Victoria called that evening and said the spreadsheets were perfect. She said this would be crucial for our support arguments. I felt grateful but also sick. My whole life had become a legal case file. Numbers on a spreadsheet. Evidence of how small I'd let myself become. The emergency hearing was 5 days after I left Keith. I sat next to Victoria in the courtroom while the baby slept in her carrier. At my feet, Keith walked in with a lawyer wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car used to be worth. His lawyer started talking immediately about how I abandoned the marital home and took the child without warning. He made it sound like I kidnapped my own daughter. He said I was unstable and acting irrationally, and Keith was just concerned about his family. Victoria let him talk for 10 minutes before she stood up. She played Keith's voicemail on the courtroom speakers. His voice screaming about ruining him and destroying his reputation echoed off the walls. She showed the judge screenshots of every locked account with timestamps. She had statements from Jake and both my parents about what Keith said about my body and how he left me at home. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked tired. She listened to everything and then asked Keith's lawyer if he had evidence that I was actually unstable or just evidence that I left an abusive situation. Keith's lawyer stumbled over his words. The judge ordered temporary support of $3,000 monthly starting immediately. She told Keith he had 48 hours to restore my access to all accounts or face contempt charges. Keith's face went red, but he didn't say anything. 2 days later, Victoria called with news about Keith's job. His boss, Cody, had apparently reported the parking lot incident to HR. Now Keith was under investigation for creating a hostile work environment. 2 women who worked with him had come forward. They said Keith made comments about their appearances after they came back from maternity leave. One said he asked when she planned to lose the baby weight in front of the whole team. Another said he told her she should consider whether she was really committed to her career if she kept taking time off for her kids. The investigation was formal and serious. Keith sent me an email blaming me for ruining his career. He said I contacted his workplace and lied about him. I forwarded it to Victoria without responding. I hadn't talked to anyone at his company. His own behavior was catching up with him and he couldn't accept that. The baby had her checkup that week. The pediatrician was nice and asked how I was doing while she checked the baby's weight and measurements. I started crying. Just completely broke down in the exam room. She handed me tissues and sat down instead of rushing to the next patient. She talked to me for 20 minutes about postpartum support and how my body was healthy and normal. She wrote down names of therapists and support groups. Then she said something that stuck with me. She mentioned she'd seen several mothers lately in situations like mine. Professional men who treated their wives like accessories they could upgrade when the model got old or damaged. She said it quietly, but I could tell she meant it. The baby was healthy and growing well. I was the one who needed help. My phone rang 3 days later from a number I didn't know. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Rosemary, Keith's sister. I'd only met her twice at family events. She lived in Seattle and barely talked to the family. She said she heard about the separation from her mother. Then she told me Keith treated her the same way growing up. He criticized her weight constantly, made comments about what she ate, told her she'd never get a boyfriend looking like that. She moved across the country right after college and only came home for major holidays. She said she recognized the pattern as soon as Heidi told her what happened. She offered to write a statement for Victoria about Keith's history of emotional abuse. I thanked her and gave her Victoria's contact information. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about how Keith had been like this his whole life. It wasn't stress or work pressure. This was who he was. Keith showed up at Jake's apartment 4 days after the hearing. Jake answered the door, and I heard Keith's voice from the guest room. He was asking to talk to me. Begging, actually. Jake came and got me, and I went to the door. Keith was holding flowers. The expensive kind from the fancy florist downtown. His eyes were red like he'd been crying. He said he was sorry. He said he was stressed about work and didn't mean any of it. He promised he'd change if I just came home. Seeing him cry almost worked. For about 30 seconds, I felt bad for him. Then I remembered him kissing my forehead and telling me to make healthy choices. I told him to leave. His face changed immediately. The tears stopped and his jaw got tight. He said I was making a huge mistake. He said I'd regret this when I couldn't afford diapers. He said the baby deserved her real family, not whatever this situation was. Jake stepped between us and told Keith to go. Keith left, but the flowers stayed on the doorstep. Jake threw them in the dumpster. I started applying for jobs that night. Remote positions I could do while watching the baby. Administrative work, customer service, data entry, anything that didn't require recent experience. My resume had a 2-year gap, but I was honest about being a stay-at-home mother. I sent out 15 applications the first day. By the end of the week, 3 companies responded wanting to interview. One was a customer service position for an insurance company. One was administrative support for a law firm. One was scheduling work for a medical office. The possibility of my own income made me feel like I could breathe again, like I'd been underwater and finally reached the surface. Heidi called again a week after Rosemary contacted Victoria. Her tone was completely different this time. She asked how the baby was doing. She asked what we needed. She didn't defend Keith or make excuses. She said Rosemary told her everything about how Keith treated her growing up. She said she was starting to see the same patterns now. She didn't apologize exactly, but she asked if she could send money for the baby. I said that would be helpful. 3 days later, a check arrived for $500 made out to me personally. It wasn't much, but it felt like someone in Keith's family finally saw the truth. Like I wasn't crazy for leaving. The insurance company called with a job offer. $18 an hour for 25 hours a week. Remote customer service taking calls about claims and coverage. It wasn't enough to live on by itself, but combined with the support payments, it meant I could start building real independence. I cried when they sent the offer letter. Actually cried with relief. My first shift was in 1 week, and I had to complete online training first. Jake offered to watch the baby during my training period. He said he worked from home anyway and could handle both. I accepted because I didn't have other options yet and because I trusted him. Victoria called with news about the financial records. Her team got the subpoena approved and pulled everything from our bank. Keith had been moving money into accounts in just his name for 8 months, since before I even got pregnant. He'd been planning to control me financially the whole time. Even if I never stood up to him, he was building his exit strategy where I'd have nothing. The spreadsheets showed $50,000 he'd hidden. The judge was not pleased. Victoria said this would help our case significantly. I felt sick reading the dates. He'd been planning this for so long. Keith got written up at work for the hostile environment investigation. The write-up went in his permanent file and affected his bonus eligibility. He sent me text messages that got more and more unhinged. He said I destroyed his career. He said I turned his family against him. He said I was poisoning everyone against him with lies. He said the baby would grow up knowing what I did. Victoria screenshot every message for the custody case. His mask was completely off now. The nice guy act he showed everyone else was gone. This was the person I'd lived with for years. The person who made me feel worthless. I blocked his number and told Victoria all communication had to go through her office. I was done talking to him directly. My parents helped me look at apartments the week after I blocked Keith. We saw 6 places in 3 days, and most were either too expensive or in bad neighborhoods, until we found a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a small building with a parking lot and laundry room. The rent was $850 a month, which I could barely afford with the support payments and my new job income, but my parents offered to cover the security deposit and first month. I signed the lease that afternoon and got the keys 2 days later. Moving day was exhausting because I didn't have much furniture yet. Just clothes and baby supplies and some kitchen stuff my mom brought from her house. Jake helped carry boxes up the stairs while my dad started installing extra locks on the door and a video doorbell he'd ordered online. The baby's room was smaller than I wanted, but I set up her crib near the window where morning light came through and hung some pictures my mom found at a thrift store. The apartment smelled like old carpet, and the bathroom tiles were cracked, but the locks were mine, and Keith didn't have keys, which mattered more than anything else. My dad tested the video doorbell 3 times to make sure it worked and showed me how to check the footage on my phone. That night, I sat on the floor of my empty living room feeding the baby and felt something close to peace for the first time in months. My first week of remote work started the following Monday, and I was terrified I'd mess it up. The training had been straightforward, but actually taking calls while managing a 4-month-old felt impossible. I scheduled my shift during her morning nap and hoped she'd sleep through most of it. But of course, she woke up 20 minutes into my first call. I muted myself while talking to a customer about their insurance claim and bounced her on my hip until she settled, then unmuted and finished the call like nothing happened. My supervisor sent me a message afterward saying she heard the baby and not to worry about background noise as long as I stayed professional with customers. The relief almost made me cry. My mom started coming over in the evenings so I could take more calls, and by the end of the week, I'd completed 25 hours and earned my first paycheck, $450 deposited into my own account that Keith couldn't touch. I stared at the balance on my phone and felt like I could breathe again. Each call I took was proof I could survive without him. Keith showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks after I moved in. It wasn't his scheduled custody time, and I was in the middle of a call when someone started pounding on my door. I muted myself and looked through the peephole and saw him standing there looking angry. The baby started crying from the noise, and I picked her up while Keith kept pounding and yelling about wanting to see his daughter. I unmuted long enough to tell the customer I needed to call them back, then hung up and dialed Victoria's number with shaking hands. She answered on the second ring, and I told her Keith was violating the custody order and wouldn't leave. She said not to open the door and to call the police if he didn't leave within 5 minutes. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Keith kept yelling through the door about his rights as a father, and how I was keeping his daughter from him, and my neighbor from across the hall opened her door and threatened to call the cops if he didn't shut up. The video doorbell was recording everything. Keith finally left after 10 minutes of pounding and yelling, and I sat on the floor holding the baby while she cried, and I cried, and my whole body shook. Victoria called back 20 minutes later and said she was filing a motion for contempt and stricter custody enforcement. She asked me to send her the video doorbell footage, which I did immediately. The contempt hearing happened 3 weeks later, and I sat in the courtroom while Victoria presented the video evidence of Keith pounding on my door and yelling. The footage showed him clearly violating the temporary custody order and making threats about taking the baby. Keith's lawyer tried to argue that he was just a concerned father who wanted to see his daughter, but the judge watched the video twice and didn't look impressed. Keith sat at his table looking furious while his lawyer whispered to him, and I could see his jaw clenching from across the room. The judge asked Keith directly if he understood that showing up at my apartment outside scheduled custody times was a violation, and Keith said yes, but tried to explain that he just missed his daughter. The judge cut him off and ordered supervised visitation, only until Keith completed an anger management course. Keith's lawyer tried to argue that I was alienating him from his daughter, but Victoria pointed out that I'd followed every custody order while Keith had violated them repeatedly. The judge agreed and said the supervision would continue until Keith could demonstrate appropriate behavior. I felt safer knowing someone would be watching when he had the baby. I found a postpartum support group that met Wednesday evenings at a community center near my apartment. My mom watched the baby during the meetings, and I sat in a circle with 8 other women who all had babies under a year old. The first night we went around introducing ourselves and talking about our struggles, and when it was my turn, I started crying before I even finished saying my name. The facilitator was a woman named Tatiana Klein, who had kind eyes and a gentle voice, and she let me cry for a minute before asking if I wanted to share what was going on. I told them about Keith and the company dinner and leaving and the custody battle, and they all nodded like they understood. One woman talked about how her husband told her she looked beautiful at 8 months postpartum, and I started crying again because I couldn't imagine Keith ever saying anything like that. He'd spent months making me feel disgusting and worthless, and hearing these women talk about partners who supported them made me realize how warped his expectations were. After the meeting, Tatiana gave me a list of therapists who specialized in trauma recovery and told me the group met every week if I wanted to keep coming. I took the list and promised I'd be back. Victoria called me the following week with news about Keith's workplace investigation. The company had concluded their review, and multiple women had reported his comments about their appearances after maternity leave and his complaints about mothers needing flexible schedules. He wasn't fired, but they put him on a performance improvement plan, which basically destroyed any chance of advancement. Victoria said this would help our case because it established a pattern of behavior beyond just our marriage. Keith sent me an email that night blaming me for ruining his career and calling me vindictive and cruel before his lawyer probably told him to stop communicating directly. The email was vicious and personal, and reading it made my hands shake, but I forwarded it to Victoria immediately. She added it to our evidence file and sent a formal letter to Keith's lawyer, reminding him that all communication needed to go through legal channels. I deleted the email and tried not to think about how much Keith hated me now. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Sarah Sutherland, who specialized in emotional abuse recovery. Her office was in a small building downtown, and the waiting room had comfortable chairs and magazines about parenting. The first session was mostly intake paperwork and basic questions about my history with Keith. But the second session, she started asking about specific things he did that made me feel controlled. I told her about the food criticism and the clothing monitoring and how he'd isolated me from friends by making me feel like I was embarrassing him. She wrote notes while I talked, and when I finished, she said everything I'd described was textbook emotional abuse. Things like criticizing my food choices and monitoring my clothing and isolating me from friends and making me responsible for his emotions were all abuse tactics designed to break me down. I'd spent years thinking I was just a bad wife who couldn't do anything right, but really I was being systematically destroyed by someone who was supposed to love me. Dr. Sutherland said recovery would take time, but I was already doing the hard work by leaving and building independence. I left that session feeling like someone finally understood what I'd been through. Keith's father, Augie, called me directly 2 weeks later, which surprised me because we'd barely spoken since the separation. He said Heidi told him everything about Keith's behavior, and he wanted to apologize for not seeing what his son was doing to me. His voice was quiet and sad, and he asked how his granddaughter was doing and if there was anything he could do to help. I told him honestly that we were managing, but things were tight financially, and he said he wanted to send money for her college fund in an account Keith couldn't access. A check arrived 3 days later for $2,000 made out to me as trustee for the baby's education fund. Augie called again after I deposited it and said he and Heidi were requiring Keith to attend therapy as a condition of their continued relationship with him. He didn't excuse Keith's behavior or try to minimize what happened, and I appreciated that more than the money. Having someone from Keith's family actually see the truth and take it seriously felt validating. Victoria called with news about the divorce proceedings. She'd filed all the paperwork, and Keith's lawyer had responded with a settlement proposal that was insulting. They wanted minimal child support based on some creative accounting of Keith's income, no spousal support beyond 6 months, and joint custody, despite his current supervised status. Victoria said we should reject it completely and prepare for litigation, which would take months, but she was confident we'd get much better terms. The proposal showed Keith still thought he could control the outcome and pay as little as possible while maintaining maximum access to the baby. I told Victoria to reject everything and fight for what we deserved. She said litigation would be expensive and stressful, but I was learning that standing up for myself meant being willing to fight long battles. I wasn't backing down anymore. The baby started sleeping 6-hour stretches at night around the same time, which felt like a miracle. I could actually get rest between work shifts and legal stress and managing everything alone. My parents visited twice a week, bringing groceries and helping with laundry, and just being present, so I didn't feel completely isolated. Jake checked in regularly through text messages, asking if I needed anything and offering to watch the baby when I had appointments. I was building a support system that didn't depend on Keith at all. Some days were still hard when the baby was fussy, or work was stressful, or I got another nasty email from Keith's lawyer, but I wasn't drowning anymore. I was getting into a rhythm of single parenting that felt sustainable. I could see a path forward that didn't involve Keith controlling every aspect of my life, and that made even the hard days bearable. My supervisor called me into her office on a Tuesday morning 3 months after I started, and I thought I was in trouble for something. She closed the door and smiled and told me they were promoting me to senior customer service representative with full-time hours and benefits starting next pay period. My salary would jump to $45,000 annually, which was more money than I'd ever made in my life. She said my professionalism and problem-solving skills were exactly what the team needed, and they'd been impressed with how I handled difficult customers and mentored newer employees. I sat there trying not to cry, because hearing someone praise my work after years of Keith telling me I wasn't good enough for anything felt completely unreal. I was actually good at something that mattered, and someone noticed and valued it enough to promote me. I called my mom from the parking lot during lunch, and she started crying too and said she was so proud of me. The benefits package included health insurance for me and the baby, which meant I wouldn't be dependent on Keith's insurance anymore. Another piece of independence I could check off the list. Victoria called that same week with news about Keith's case. He'd completed his anger management course, and his lawyer filed a petition for unsupervised visitation rights. The court scheduled a hearing, and the custody evaluator would testify about Keith's behavior during the supervised visits over the past few months. Victoria warned me the judge would probably grant standard visitation, since Keith had followed all the court orders, and the evaluator's reports showed appropriate interaction with the baby. I felt sick thinking about sending her overnight with him, but Victoria said the evaluator assured her Keith had been on his best behavior and showed no concerning signs. The hearing happened 2 weeks later, and I sat in the courtroom while the evaluator testified that Keith attended every scheduled visit, followed all guidelines, interacted appropriately with the child, and completed his required anger management program. The judge granted him alternating weekends, Friday evening through Sunday evening plus Wednesday evenings from 5 to 8. Standard visitation for a father with no current safety concerns. I wanted to scream that he wasn't safe, that he was just performing for the evaluator, but I had no proof beyond my gut feeling. Keith looked smug when the judge announced the schedule, and his lawyer shook his hand like they'd won something. Victoria squeezed my shoulder and reminded me this was temporary, that we'd revisit custody in the final divorce settlement. The first overnight exchange happened on a Friday evening 3 weeks later. I packed the diaper bag with detailed instructions about the baby's eating schedule, nap times, favorite toys, bedtime routine. I wrote everything down like Keith had never spent time with his own daughter. He showed up at my apartment exactly at 6 like the court order specified, and I handed over the baby with shaking hands. She reached for me when he took her, and I almost grabbed her back. Keith's face was neutral, carefully blank, playing the responsible father role. He loaded her car seat into his vehicle and drove away, and I stood in my doorway watching until his taillights disappeared. I barely slept that entire weekend. I checked my phone every 20 minutes expecting a call that something was wrong. I texted Keith twice asking how she was doing, and he sent back brief responses that she was fine. Saturday dragged by in slow motion. I cleaned my apartment, did laundry, meal prepped for the week, anything to keep my hands busy. Sunday morning, I woke up at 5 and couldn't fall back asleep. The custody order said he'd return her by 6 Sunday evening. At 5:30, I was watching out my window. At 5:45, his car pulled into the parking lot. He carried her to my door and she seemed fine, not upset or scared or hurt. He handed over the diaper bag and left without saying anything beyond confirming our next exchange date. I checked the baby over completely, looking for any signs something was wrong, but she was just tired and ready for bed. Keith had followed the schedule, fed her properly, kept her clean and safe. He was clearly on his best behavior, trying to prove he could be trusted with unsupervised time. I realized this was going to be my life now, co-parenting with someone I didn't trust, but legally had to share custody with. Sending my daughter to spend time with a man who'd emotionally destroyed me for years, but was smart enough to hide it from evaluators and judges. Jake came over for coffee the following Wednesday afternoon during my lunch break. The baby was napping, and we sat at my kitchen table talking about work and his new project at his job. He got quiet for a minute and then said he needed to tell me something. He said he had feelings for me beyond friendship and had for a while now. I wasn't entirely surprised, because I'd noticed the way he looked at me sometimes, and how he always made time when I needed help. But I also wasn't ready for any kind of relationship beyond what we already had. I told him honestly that I needed time to figure out who I was outside of being Keith's wife, before I could even think about dating anyone I'd spent years being told I wasn't good enough, and I needed space to rebuild my sense of self without jumping into something new. Jake nodded and said he understood completely, and he'd be here whenever I was ready. No pressure. It was exactly the right response. He didn't push or make me feel guilty or try to convince me. He just accepted my boundary and stayed my friend. 4 months after our separation, I saw on social media that Keith was dating someone new. A mutual acquaintance's Instagram story showed them at some restaurant downtown. I clicked through to the woman's profile, which was public, and scrolled through her photos. She was thin and blonde with perfect makeup in every picture, exactly the type Keith always said he preferred. My first reaction was this ugly jealousy mixed with insecurity, wondering if he'd finally found someone who met his impossible standards. But then I looked at her smiling face in those photos and felt genuinely sorry for her. She had no idea what she was getting into. She probably thought Keith was charming and successful and attentive. She didn't know about the criticism that would start slowly, the comments about her appearance disguised as concern, the way he'd make her feel like nothing she did was ever enough. I hoped she'd figure it out faster than I did, and get out before he destroyed her self-worth completely. Victoria's team finished discovery in the divorce case, and she called me to discuss what they'd found. Keith's co-workers had provided depositions as part of proving the emotional abuse pattern, and several of them mentioned things Keith had said about me over the years. He'd been complaining about me to people at his office since before the baby was born, calling me lazy for being a stay-at-home mother and unmotivated for not working. One coworker testified that Keith regularly made disparaging comments about my appearance and said I'd let myself go. Another mentioned Keith comparing me unfavorably to other wives who'd maintained their figures after having children. Reading those depositions hurt worse than I expected because these were people I'd met at company events. People who'd smiled at me and made small talk while Keith was trashing me behind my back. They'd all known how he really felt about me, and nobody said anything. Victoria said the depositions helped prove the pattern of emotional abuse, which would strengthen our case for primary custody and better support terms. But that didn't make it easier to read. I started exercising again around the same time, but not because I wanted to lose weight or look different. I needed stress relief and a way to do something physical that wasn't work or childcare. I found a postpartum fitness class at a community center that met Tuesday and Thursday evenings when my mom could watch the baby. The class was specifically for mothers recovering from pregnancy, and everyone there had similar bodies with soft stomachs and stretch marks. Nobody commented on anyone's appearance or pushed unrealistic fitness goals. We just moved our bodies in ways that felt good and built strength gradually. The instructor talked about honoring what our bodies had done in carrying and feeding babies, rather than trying to fix or shrink ourselves. Moving felt good for the first time since before I got pregnant. I was building actual strength in my arms and legs and core, instead of trying to make myself smaller to meet someone else's standards. My body had carried and fed my daughter, and that was something to celebrate, not fix. Keith's new girlfriend broke up with him after just 2 months. I heard through the same mutual connections that had shown me they were dating. Apparently, she'd found him controlling and critical about small things like what she ordered at restaurants and how she styled her hair. Part of me felt validated that I wasn't crazy, that other women saw the same patterns I'd experienced. But mostly, I just felt tired of Keith's whole cycle of treating women badly. Rosemary called me after she heard about the breakup and said she wasn't surprised at all. She said Keith would keep doing this to every woman he dated until he faced real consequences that forced actual change, and even then she wasn't sure he was capable of it. Some people were just built to tear others down to feel better about themselves. The custody evaluation report came back in early November, and Victoria called me as soon as she received it. The evaluator recommended I have primary physical custody with Keith maintaining his standard visitation schedule. The report cited his history of emotional abuse and anger issues as concerns for the child's long-term well-being, even though his recent behavior had been appropriate. The evaluator noted that Keith's compliance during supervised visits appeared performative, and she had concerns about his ability to co-parent effectively long-term. Keith's lawyer immediately filed objections and argued the evaluator was biased. But Victoria said the evaluator's testimony about Keith's behavior during the evaluation process itself would support her recommendation. Apparently, Keith had been dismissive and hostile when discussing me during his interview, and made several disparaging comments that raised red flags. I cried with relief when Victoria read me the full report, because finally someone official was recognizing that Keith shouldn't have equal custody. Someone with credentials and authority was saying what I'd known all along. I bought a car 2 weeks later with money I'd saved from working, plus some help from my parents. It was a used sedan, nothing fancy, but it was registered in my name only, and Keith had no access to it or knowledge of it. Having transportation that Keith didn't control or monitor felt like another huge piece of independence. I could go anywhere without asking permission or explaining where I'd been. I could take the baby places on my schedule without coordinating with anyone. The first weekend I had the car, I drove to the beach with the baby just because I could. We sat in the sand and she played with her toys while I watched the ocean, and felt genuinely free for the first time in years. 6 months later, I sat in Lucian Broderick's mediation office across from Keith, and it felt like watching a stranger. The conference room had gray walls and a long table, and Lucian sat at the head taking notes while Keith's lawyer shuffled papers. Keith smiled at Lucian and made small talk about the weather and his golf game, trying that charm thing he did with people he wanted to impress. Lucian just nodded politely and redirected to the financial documents spread between us. We went through child support calculations based on Keith's salary, and I watched him try to downplay his income until Lucian pointed to the tax returns Victoria had submitted. Keith's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with his own documents. His lawyer proposed minimal spousal support for 6 months, and Victoria immediately countered with 3 years, and we spent an hour going back and forth while I sat there realizing this was actually happening. I was negotiating the end of my marriage like a business deal. Keith kept glancing at me like he expected me to cave or apologize, but I just took notes on everything Lucian said. We were far apart on almost every term, but at least nobody was yelling. At least I had lawyers and mediators between us instead of him cornering me in our kitchen. The second mediation session happened 2 weeks later, and Keith's lawyer came in with a new proposal. Reasonable child support based on his actual income, 2 years of spousal support while I established my career, and the custody arrangement the evaluator had recommended with me having primary physical custody. Victoria looked at me, and I could tell she thought it was fair even if it wasn't everything we'd asked for. Keith looked angry about the whole thing, his face tight and his hands clenched on the table, but his lawyer had clearly told him this was the best he'd get. Victoria asked for a break so we could talk privately, and we went to a small office down the hall. She laid out the numbers and explained that fighting for more would cost me thousands in legal fees and months of my life, and this settlement gave me what I needed most: security for the baby, time to build my career, and primary custody. I thought about dragging this out for another 6 months and facing Keith in court and dealing with his anger through more depositions and hearings. I was tired. I wanted it over. I told Victoria I'd accept the terms, and we went back to the conference room. Keith's lawyer drew up the agreement, and we all signed it that afternoon. Keith wouldn't look at me as we left the building. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning, 8 months after I'd left Keith standing in that parking lot. The courthouse was busy with people waiting for various hearings, and I sat on a bench with Victoria going over last-minute details. Keith arrived with his lawyer and sat on the opposite side of the hallway, and we didn't speak or make eye contact. The judge called our case, and we filed into a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor polish. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement and asked if we both understood and agreed to the terms. We each said yes. She asked if there was any reason the divorce shouldn't be granted. Silence. Then she signed the papers and said we were legally divorced, and just like that, it was done. 8 months of separation and legal proceedings and emotional hell reduced to a judge's signature. I felt relief wash over me so strong I almost cried right there in the courtroom. I was free. Legally, officially free from someone who'd spent years making me feel worthless. Keith looked angry as we left, his face red and his movements sharp, but I didn't care about his feelings anymore. His emotions weren't my problem. My daughter would grow up watching me be independent and strong, and that mattered more than anything. Keith felt I got promoted at work 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. My supervisor called me into her office, and I thought I was in trouble for something. But instead she offered me a team lead position overseeing 5 customer service reps. The salary was $55,000 annually, more than I'd ever made before I stopped working to stay home with the baby. She said my performance had been excellent, and she wanted to get me into management training within the next year. I sat there trying not to cry because someone was valuing my work and seeing my potential and offering me opportunities for growth. My career trajectory was better than it had ever been before I became a stay-at-home mother. I was building a professional identity that had nothing to do with being anyone's wife. That afternoon, I called my parents, and my mom cried happy tears over the phone. My dad said he was proud of me, and he'd never doubted I could do this. I bought myself flowers on the way home and put them on my kitchen table in my apartment that Keith had never been inside. Jake asked me to dinner on a Saturday night almost a year after I'd left Keith. Not dinner with the baby like we'd done dozens of times, but actual dinner just the two of us while my mom watched the baby at my apartment. I knew what he was asking without him having to say it directly. We'd been dancing around this for months. The attraction and care obvious, but neither of us pushing because I needed time to heal. I said yes because I wanted to, not because I felt pressured or obligated. The restaurant was quiet and we talked about everything except Keith and divorce and custody arrangements. Jake told me about a project at his job, and I told him about the management training program I'd be starting. We laughed about stupid things, and I realized I felt comfortable in a way I never had with Keith. Being with someone who treated me like an equal partner felt revolutionary after years of being made to feel less than. We took things slow because I was still learning to trust, and Jake was patient with that. He never pressured me or made me feel like I wasn't enough. We were building something healthy based on mutual respect instead of control and criticism. Keith started going to therapy after his parents threatened to reduce contact with him. Rosemary told me about it over coffee one afternoon, saying their mom and dad had finally recognized the pattern of behavior and given Keith an ultimatum: get help or lose access to family events and his relationship with them. I was skeptical about his motivation because Keith only did things when they benefited him, but I noticed he was less hostile during custody exchanges. He'd show up on time, follow the schedule, return the baby's things without complaint. He even asked politely about her routine instead of demanding information like he used to. Rosemary warned me that real change takes years, and I shouldn't expect miracles. Some people went to therapy and learned to fake appropriate behavior without actually changing their core beliefs. I maintained firm boundaries regardless of what Keith did or didn't do in therapy. His growth or lack of it wasn't my responsibility anymore. I pulled up photos on my phone one evening after the baby fell asleep and scrolled back to a year ago. There was a picture my mom had taken of me holding the baby 2 weeks after I'd left Keith. My face looked exhausted and scared and lost. I barely recognized that woman now. I'd built a career from nothing, established a home, developed a support system of friends and family and professionals who helped me. I'd learned to value myself independent of anyone else's opinion. My body was strong and capable, and I'd stopped caring about the number on the scale or fitting into old genes. I was teaching my daughter through my example that women don't exist to be decorative or to meet someone else's standards. She was watching me work and parent and build a life, and someday she'd understand that her worth came from who she was, not how she looked. The baby's first birthday party happened on a Saturday afternoon at my apartment. My parents came early to help set up decorations, and Jake brought a cake from the bakery downtown. Friends from my support group arrived with presents, and Tatiana brought a card signed by everyone in our Tuesday night sessions. Keith's parents showed up right on time with a huge stuffed animal, and Augie hugged me and said how proud he was of the life I'd built. Heidi was quieter, but she helped in the kitchen and played with the baby and seemed genuinely happy to be included. Keith had his own celebration during his custody time the next day, and I was okay with that. We could both be good parents separately. We didn't have to pretend to be a family for appearances. My daughter was loved and safe and had people who cared about her, and that's what mattered. She smashed cake all over her face, and everyone laughed and took pictures, and I felt genuinely happy in a way I hadn't felt in years. I signed a lease on a bigger 2-bedroom apartment in a better neighborhood 6 weeks later. The rent was higher but affordable now, with my increased income and spousal support ending in another year. The baby would have her own room with space to play. Instead of sleeping in the corner of my bedroom, I spent a weekend painting her room a soft yellow and assembling furniture I'd bought from a discount store. Every choice I made about our home reflected my values and preferences without anyone's criticism. I picked out a couch I liked and hung pictures I wanted to see, and organized the kitchen the way that made sense to me. My parents helped me move, and my dad installed shelves in the baby's closet. Jake came over with tools and fixed the loose bathroom door handle and rehung a cabinet that was crooked. Standing in my new living room surrounded by boxes, I felt proud of what I'd accomplished. This was mine. Jake and I talked about future possibilities one evening while sitting on my new couch after the baby went to sleep. He asked where I saw things going between us, and I appreciated that he was direct instead of making me guess what he wanted. I told him honestly that I wasn't ready to rush into anything serious after my experience with Keith. I was still learning who I was outside of being someone's wife, and I needed to keep building my independence. Jake said he understood, and he wasn't going anywhere. We were both learning what partnership looked like between equals, building something at a pace that respected my healing process. He'd proven through consistent actions over the past year that he valued me as a whole person, not just as someone to fill a role in his life that mattered more than timelines or labels. We were figuring it out together. Over the following months, I started reaching out to friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Sarah from college responded to my message within an hour, and we met for lunch the next week while my mom watched the baby sitting across from her at the sandwich shop. I realized how much I'd missed having friends who knew me before Keith. She told me she'd noticed how he always corrected me in public or made jokes about my choices, and she'd wanted to say something but didn't know how without making things worse. 2 other friends said similar things when I reconnected with them. They'd seen him criticize what I ordered at restaurants or comment on my appearance in ways that seemed off, but they hadn't been sure if I wanted help. We started meeting regularly for coffee or walks, and I was honest about everything that had happened instead of pretending my life was perfect, like I did when I was with Keith. Having people I could tell the truth to without shame felt like finally being able to breathe properly. Keith's romantic life became a pattern I heard about through mutual connections, but stopped paying attention to after the third or fourth girlfriend left him within weeks. Someone would mention he was dating someone new, and then a month later I'd hear they'd broken up because she found him controlling or critical. His sister Rosemary told me one woman lasted exactly 2 weeks before she figured out what he was like. I focused on making custody exchanges smooth and keeping communication limited to logistics through our shared calendar app. His personal life wasn't my problem anymore, and eventually our daughter would be old enough to see his patterns and make her own decisions about their relationship. I had my own life to build. I enrolled in online business courses through a community college program focused on small business development and marketing. Sitting at my laptop after the baby went to sleep, I worked through modules about business plans and financial projections and client acquisition. Having professional goals beyond my current job made me feel like I was building towards something bigger that I was creating myself. My parents came over one Saturday, and my dad asked what my business idea was, and I explained wanting to do consulting in my field eventually. My mom said they'd set aside $10,000 to help with startup costs when I was ready, and my dad added that they believed in me. Keith's voice in my head telling me I wasn't capable of running my own business got quieter every time I completed another course module. The custody arrangement settled into a routine where Keith had the baby alternating weekends from Friday evening to Sunday evening, plus Wednesday evenings from 5 to 8. I missed her during his time, especially the first few weekends, but I also started appreciating the space to focus on work projects and take care of myself without managing a toddler's needs. Co-parenting with someone who'd been emotionally abusive was complicated and required detailed scheduling and minimal direct communication, but we made it work. Our exchanges happened in public parking lots, and we kept conversations to necessary information about the baby's schedule or needs. It wasn't ideal, but it was functional, and our daughter seemed happy and secure with both of us. I reached my pre-pregnancy weight naturally, about 14 months after leaving Keith through stress reduction and regular movement and eating without constant criticism. The number on the scale was the same as before I got pregnant, but more importantly, I stopped caring what it said. My body was healthy and strong and allowed me to work full days and parent actively and live the life I wanted. I went to exercise classes not to lose weight, but because moving felt good, and I was building muscle and endurance. My body had carried and birthed and fed my daughter, and that was worth celebrating, not fixing. I was teaching her through my example that women's worth came from who they were and what they did, not how they looked in jeans. Keith's parents called one evening, and Heidi asked if they could take the baby for a weekend visit at their house to spend time with her and introduce her to cousins. I told them I needed to check with Victoria about legal implications and called her the next morning. Victoria said it was fine as long as Keith wasn't going to be there unsupervised, and I trusted them. I agreed, and Augie promised they'd send lots of photos and keep me updated. That weekend, they sent pictures of her playing with 3 cousins in their backyard and being spoiled by grandparents who clearly loved her. Augie called Sunday evening when they brought her home and told me they were proud of how I'd built a good life for her, and they wanted to stay involved as grandparents separate from whatever issues they had with their son. Jake's relationship with the baby developed naturally over the months we dated and eventually moved in together. She started lighting up when she saw him and reaching for him to pick her up and bringing him books to read to her. He was careful about not trying to replace Keith or act like her father, and he always respected that I was her mother, and Keith was her father. When she called him Jake instead of trying to say daddy, he smiled and said that was perfect. We talked about blended family dynamics and agreed to let things develop at her pace without forcing anything. I knew when I was ready to think about more serious family possibilities, he'd approach it with the same patience and respect he'd shown from the beginning. I celebrated 18 months since leaving Keith by taking myself and the baby on a beach weekend to a small town 3 hours away. Sitting in the sand watching her toddle around and squeal at the waves, I felt genuinely content in a way I hadn't felt in years. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I made my own money and my own choices, and I was raising my daughter in a home without criticism or control or walking on eggshells. The woman Keith had said was too embarrassing for public was thriving without him. I had a career and friends and a healthy relationship, and most importantly, I had myself back. My consulting business launched officially with 3 clients I'd cultivated through my current job network who needed help with projects in my specialty area. I was working toward eventually being fully self-employed, which would give me flexibility for parenting and higher income potential. Building something that was entirely my own creation felt incredible. Keith had predicted I couldn't make it without him and his financial support, but I was proving every day that I was more capable than he'd ever let me believe. One morning I stopped at a coffee shop near my apartment and saw Rebecca sitting alone at a corner table. She looked up and recognized me, and her face went red. I could have walked past, but something made me go over to her table. She immediately started apologizing for not speaking up during the parking lot confrontation that night, saying she'd been afraid of Keith's reaction and how he'd treat her at work. I sat down, and she told me she'd gotten divorced 6 months ago from her own controlling husband, and wished she'd had my courage sooner. Her husband had been the one who'd paid for her tummy tuck and personal trainer and nutritionist, and he'd controlled everything about her appearance and schedule. She'd finally left after he told her she was getting too old, and he wanted her to consider cosmetic procedures to stay attractive. We exchanged numbers, and I invited her to my Tuesday support group, and she started crying and said yes. Sitting there watching her wipe her eyes, I realized my story had helped someone else find the strength to leave. That mattered more than I'd expected it to. The baby started stringing words together around 18 months, and one morning while I was getting dressed for a client meeting, she pointed at me and said clear as day, "Mama strong." I froze with my shirt halfway on because I'd heard my parents say that exact phrase to her dozens of times during their visits. My dad would lift her up and say it while watching me handle work calls and custody exchanges. My mom would repeat it while we played on the floor. And now here was my daughter, not even 2 years old, already learning that her mama was strong. I sat down on the bed and cried happy tears while she patted my face with her tiny hands, and I thought about how she'd grow up knowing women could be capable and independent. She wouldn't learn to make herself smaller for anyone. She'd know her worth from the beginning because I was showing her every single day. 3 weeks later, Keith's name appeared in my inbox for the first time in months, and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. The email was long and detailed about his therapy progress and how he understood now what he'd done to me. He wrote about recognizing his patterns and working to change them. He said he was sorry for making me feel worthless and controlling every part of my life. I read it twice and waited for some feeling of validation or closure, but mostly I just felt tired. His growth journey wasn't my responsibility anymore, and I didn't need his apology to know I deserved better. I forwarded the whole thing to Victoria for our records in case it mattered legally, then archived it and went back to reviewing a client proposal. My healing work was done, and his acknowledgement changed nothing about my life now. Jake and I had been dating for over a year when he suggested moving in together, and instead of feeling scared, I felt ready. We spent weeks looking at places that would work for both of us and the baby, somewhere with good schools and a yard and enough space for everyone. The house we found had 3 bedrooms and a kitchen with windows that let in morning light. We moved in on a Saturday with help from my parents and Jake's brother. The baby loved having Jake around all the time. She'd wake up asking for him and bring him books to read and help him make breakfast. We created routines together where we both contributed and both made decisions. He never tried to replace Keith or act like her father. He respected that I was her mother, and Keith was her father, and he was building his own relationship with her. I'd never thought I could trust someone enough to share space again after Keith, but Jake had proven himself through consistent actions over time. He showed up when he said he would. He respected my boundaries. He treated me like an equal partner in everything. 2 years after leaving Keith, I was running a successful consulting business with 12 regular clients and revenue that exceeded what I'd made in my old job. My home office had a view of the backyard where the baby played on her swing set. Jake and I split household tasks and parenting duties fairly. Keith and I had a functional co-parenting relationship with clear boundaries and regular communication through a parenting app. My daughter was growing up watching me be independent and successful, and in a healthy relationship, she saw me run my business and make my own money and make my own choices. She saw Jake treat me with respect and partnership. She learned that women could be strong and capable and valued. Life wasn't perfect because real life never is, but it was genuinely happy in a way I'd never experienced during my marriage. I was proud of the woman I'd become, and the life I'd built, and the example I was setting for my daughter every single day. That's the story for today. Thank you for staying until the end. It really means a lot. I hope it left you with something gentle or hopeful.